Today, we take it almost for given that China shapes US-India relations. My book argues and shows that China's influence on the US-India relationship is not recent, and it wasn't episodic. In fact, this China's influence goes back to the early years of independence and of the early years of the Cold War. And that I argue that while it is clearly not the only factor that mattered in shaping US-India relationships historically, without understanding the role of China, you really cannot get a fuller understanding and a more comprehensive understanding of India-US relations without considering this factor. The second argument that this book makes is something to be said about the present and what history tells us about the present and the future. You hear arguments these days about whether or not a US-India alignment or partnership versus China is natural, it will naturally happen, or whether it's impossible because India doesn't do alignments or alliances. Well, my book shows that a US-India alignment or partnership versus China is neither inevitable nor impossible. It depends on certain conditions, and the book lays that out. And those conditions are that a US-India partnership requires not just convergence on the nature of a China challenge, but also on the urgency of that challenge and how to approach that challenge. And we maybe can get into kind of the details of that in the Q&A. But what I want to talk about first is kind of how this book started, and then just take you through the book, which covers the period 1949 to 1979. And start with the origins. I mean, when you're sitting in the archives, and this book has a lot of work that's based on archival research, on looking at newspapers from the time. When you're sitting in the archives, you feel a little bit, as Nilanjan talked about it, as a fly in the wall. And I was a fly in the wall, so to speak, in Austin, Texas, at the Lyndon Johnson Library, where I was going through papers from the Johnson administration related to US-India relations. And what I found was that they were quite intriguing to me, because China kept popping up in the discussion. And two things in particular struck me. Two kind of stories struck me, two documents. One was US operational plans to intervene militarily on behalf of India if China intervened on behalf of Pakistan in the 1965 India-Pakistan War. This is something I didn't really know about. I knew obviously about the 1962 war and US involvement there, but this was intriguing to me. And the second was that there are detailed logs of rainfall amounts in India and their impact on Indian agriculture and the economy in these Johnson papers. It's things that LBJ himself and a number of officials seem to keep a close eye on. And the reason they were keeping a close eye on these kind of detailed rainfall figures was they wanted to ensure that India's economy succeeded and that a democratic India succeeded and didn't fail, while Soviet-backed communist China succeeded. And so this was intriguing to me because here there were these instances, historical from the mid-60s, where China seemed to be figuring in US policymakers' minds when they were thinking about India. And so I wanted to go and see how far back that influence in American policymakers' minds went, and how far back did China also influence how Indian policymakers were thinking about the US? And what I found was that this role of China went back to early years of Indian independence. China was what lay behind the warm welcome Nehru received when he became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Washington in 1949. President Truman went to receive him at the airport. He took along 3 cabinet members and an honor guard. The US Congress hosted Prime Minister Nehru for a speech. What was the reason behind all this fanfare when Nehru came to Washington? What American policymakers saw as the loss of China to communism. Because just a few days before Nehru's visit in October 1949, Mao Zedong had declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. The establishment in the US now saw democratic India, this new kind of fledgling democracy, as quote unquote the hope of Asia. And the US thought and believed that this democratic India could serve as a counterbalance and contrast to China. But during the course of Nehru's visit itself, and particularly in its aftermath, it became clear that India did not share the same view of and did not share the same approach to China as the US. And what that led to between 1949 and till about 1956 was a period of what I call in the book divergence. Instead of convergence on China pushing the US and India together, as we're familiar with today, during this period between 1949 and 1956, there was divergence between the US and India on China. The two countries disagreed about various sets of issues, whether to recognize the People's Republic of China or not, what to do about the Chinese takeover of Tibet, China's role in the Korean War and the reasons for its intervention, but also China's role in Southeast Asia. And finally, they disagreed on the approach to China. Even the Nehru government had some concerns about China, but they thought that the best way to mitigate or resolve those concerns was to engage China rather than to contain it, which they saw as the US approach. Prime Minister Nehru thought that bringing China into the international community instead of isolating it would encourage it to be a responsible stakeholder. But the Truman, and then when President Eisenhower came to office, those two administrations on the US side did not think that you could encourage or get China to be a responsible stakeholder. And these differences on China had an adverse impact on the US-India relationship, not just in the administration in the US, but also on Capitol Hill, where in the US Congress it negatively affected discussions on whether or not and how much to aid India at the time. And that in turn caused resentment in New Delhi. But then around 1956, 1957, there's a start of what I call in the book a period of convergence. There's a change on China in both the US and India. And over the next few years, through about 1962, Delhi's and Washington's diagnosis of the China problem and their prescription for it start to converge. In the US, President Eisenhower starts to see the Cold War not just primarily as a geopolitical conflict, but also an ideological and economic competition more so as well. And in this context, the US could not see a democratic India fall behind while Soviet-backed communist China succeeded. And in this kind of argument, Washington had to help India win what was then called in the West, the fateful race against China. In India, Prime Minister Nehru and his officials had become more concerned about China as a geopolitical threat by this point in 56-57. For one, the boundary dispute comes to the fore in 1956-57 and intensifies over this period, obviously culminating in the 62 war. But India at this point is also concerned about China's increasing influence in Nepal. And then the Dalai Lama's escape to India in 1959 led to further strain between the two Asian giants. But you also see ideological and economic concerns in India as well about China. The Nehru government was concerned that communism next door would succeed in delivering the goods, so to speak, economically, and demonstrate that communism and communist governments were better at delivering the goods to the people than his democratic government was. And not only, so you see this convergence in perception on China, that it is now both the US and India see China as a concern, as a challenge. But you also see the US and India agreeing now on what to do about this challenge. And that part of the answer for both countries was a partnership with each other. For India, this came with American economic and eventually military assistance to India, culminating in direct American assistance, obviously, that we know about during the 1962 China-India War. But after that period, after that kind of the culmination of that in the 62 China-India War, you see over the next few years between 1963 and 1968 on the question of China, what I call a period of dependence and disillusionment between the US and India. And what happens is that while the two countries continue to agree that China is a major threat, they come to disagree on what to do about it. So on the one hand, there's dependence still between the two countries on this subject. India still needs the US to externally and internally balance against China. And the US on its part still needs India not to fail politically, economically, or militarily while China took a leadership role in Asia. And so what that meant was you continued to see large amounts of US economic assistance going to India. You even saw military assistance even after the 62 war, You saw intelligence sharing, with India allowing, for example, U-2 spy planes to take off from bases in India to conduct reconnaissance over China. You see an air defense agreement signed in 1963 that called for mutual consultations in the event between the US and India in the event of another Chinese attack on India. You even see bizarre kind of initiatives like a joint US-India expedition to the Himalayas to place a nuclear-powered monitoring device there to keep an eye on the Chinese nuclear program. But during this period in the 60s, you also see disagreement between the US and India on the subject of how to approach this China challenge. There is kind of disagreement on how to spend resources, how India should spend resources, whether India should be spending that much on defense or whether it should be focusing on development at home. There's disagreement on whether Pakistan could be part of India's China solution, as Washington believed, or if it was part of India's China problem, as Delhi saw it. There's disagreement between the US and India on whether India should have a more exclusive partnership with the US-led bloc, or whether India should maintain a diversified portfolio of partnerships, as Delhi preferred, a set of partnerships that included a very important one with Moscow. But there's also disillusionment in this period. In both Delhi and Washington, there's concern about whether the other country was capable of playing a helpful role in Asia and against China. And you see this mix of dependence and disillusionment. You hear it in a phone call, of which is available online, between President Johnson and his US ambassador to the UN. President Johnson is frustrated with India's lack of economic reform. And he just says, we are doing so much to help against China, to hold up fighting a war in Vietnam, to save all these Asian countries from communism. And why doesn't India do its part? And so the US ambassador to the UN turns around and says, okay, let India fail then. Let it go communist. And Johnson stops his rant against India then and says, no, I can't do that. I can't lose India, because that's what they said Truman and Acheson did with China. And for him, if he lost India, not only would that be a blow to the US strategic framework and objectives in Asia, it would be politically harmful for him, as he saw it had been for President Truman and Acheson. And he thought the Democratic Party could not recover from that loss. But towards the end of his administration, as it starts to become clearer that India could actually manage, it wouldn't fall or fail, that it could manage independently to keep China at bay. And this was in part thanks to the 1967 Natala clashes, where India comes out actually quite well. But also the economy starts to recover from the setbacks in 65 and 66 in particular. By then, the US becomes a little bit more, the Johnson administration says, India can manage. And you see the two sides start to drift apart. They don't need each other that much anymore. And over the next decade, from about 1969 to 1979, which is the rest of the decade this book covers, what we see overall is a period of disengagement, but with one key period divergence that comes first. Once again, a period of divergence driven by China. But this time, it's in a different way, thanks to the China-US rapprochement. Earlier, it had been a divergence because India had been urging China and the US to talk. Now, it's a divergence because India is the target of that rapprochement in some ways, inadvertently. In the lead up to and during the 1971 India-Pakistan War, this effort at China-US rapprochement on the part of the Nixon administration, particularly President Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, meant that India found it could not depend on the US coming to its assistance if China intervened on behalf of Pakistan. And one thing we forget now, that from about 1962-63, there was a sense in Delhi that they had an implicit assurance from the US that this would happen. And what they also found is that Nixon and Kissinger were backing Chinese partner Pakistan, which was serving for them as a channel to China. Indeed, this fact of needing to back Chinese partner Pakistan, indeed even led Nixon and Kissinger to encourage China to intervene on behalf of Pakistan during the war. And so this leads to that real low point, which has of course been written about considerably in the US-India relationship, that is remembered to this day, and that moment of the US's enterprise coming into the Bay of Bengal. But it's also led to India deepening its engagement with the Soviet Union and signing that 1971 treaty between the two countries. And this kind of led to, while it led to India deepening engagement with the Soviet Union, between the US and India, this final period that my book covers is really one of disengagement between about 1973 and 1979. And it's not just because of the 1971 war and the fallout from that. Significantly, it's because that with the rapprochement with China, having made up with China because of its larger goals vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, the US no longer needed India as a counter balance in Asia. India, on its part, now had a Soviet insurance policy against China and also moved towards an independent nuclear deterrent around this point. And so, and nonetheless, though, while kind of the two sides had started, they had new friends, so to speak, closer new friends, you see a period where India becomes wary of overdependence on Moscow. And so it seeks to do two things during the Ford and Carter administrations that followed the Nixon administration. For one, what you see first Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and then Prime Minister Morarji Desai doing is they try to stabilize relations with the US. And second, they seek India's own rapprochement with China. And this was indeed something the US not just supported, the Ford and Carter administrations not just supported during this time, but they tried to facilitate. And so you see kind of this relationship, this US, India, China triangle come full circle, so to speak. In 1949, you had India encouraging China and the US to engage. And now by 1979, you have the US encouraging China and India to do so. And my book ends with a meeting in April 1979 with President Carter and then Foreign Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, where Carter's indeed, that is what he's encouraging, that India and that Prime Minister Desai and Foreign Minister Vajpayee should continue their effort at making up with China. There had been some disappointment after the Vajpayee visit to China earlier that year, that when the China-Vietnam War had broken out, that India felt betrayed in some ways. But Carter encouraged him to continue India's rapprochement with China. And so my book ends with that meeting in which kind of China is being discussed. And of course, 2 decades after that meeting in 1979, Vajpayee was Prime Minister, and we saw the beginnings of what we consider today's phase of convergence. And with that, kind of, I will end the historical part, and maybe we can get into some of the contemporary resonance of the book in Q&A.